Welcome and thank you for joining today. We are excited to have you here for our Pathlock Innovation Series. This is our last session for today. And our session name is Building a Business Case for SAP. Before I go ahead and before Steve goes ahead and starts the presentation, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any audio issues during this webinar, click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming from your speakers. There will also be a Q&A session following the presentation. So please type any questions into the Q&A chat box for Steve to answer at the end of the event. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. I am going to put a link in the chat right now. And if you would like to register for any of the sessions coming up tomorrow or any of the following days for the Pathlock Innovation Series, you can click on that link and it will take you to the registration pages. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Steve.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm Steve Dubrovac, and I was told I needed to give you a face with my name. So while I can't say I'm wild about my face, I do like my name, and this is me. I've got a bit of experience in the space. I served both on the, you could say, buy side and sell side of compliance software. I ran a solution. I was the application owner for a solution that handled about $1 billion in R&D spend, and I've been very focused on the compliance and security space over the last couple of decades. This session is really going to be about how do we build a business case for SAP compliance and security. Throughout today's session, we'll be talking about building the business case in terms of the stages that you would go through to build a business case, the steps, and then a couple of tips to keep in mind throughout the process. I want to caution everybody that this is not a session on here is the perfect template to fill out. Every company is going to be different. Every organization is going to have its own priorities, its own letterhead, if you will, its own templates that work for them. I would really encourage you to find a project that had a successful business case built for it over the past 9 to 18 months and use that in combination with what we'll cover in today's session. So the first two stages of building a business case, and this I think is a good framework for setting the stage for how to manage stakeholders, for how to anticipate the kinds of questions that you're going to get as you go about building the business case for compliance and for security and control on your SAP platform. Stage one is really going to be about building interest and sharing the value of what you have in mind. For example, perhaps it has to do with automating the user lifecycle management, automating the compliance provisioning, the compliant provisioning process. And you'll go through and talk about the value associated with automating request and approval processes. Or maybe it's going to be about establishing a strong SOD framework for your business and automating some of the controls associated with SOD risk control. And so you're going to really focus on how to automate mitigations or minimize the amount of confusion around how to mitigate and monitor SOD conflicts. But the stage one is really going to be about building interest and value. Stage two, when we get to these 5 steps, will be about building commitment. How do you begin to move beyond this being a good idea and establish a business case that helps bring together stakeholders in a way that really establishes a framework for commitment? So how do these two general stages map onto a 5-step process? It's like this. Step one is really around using the language to describe the, the proposal in terms of what the business cares about, in terms of what really the business is all about. The second step is framing the value uniquely for each stakeholder. One of the interesting things about security and compliance projects is that there is a wide variety of stakeholders. There's the users and the business management side. There's the IT folks and the folks who are going to have to manage the technical aspects of the controls. And then there's audit. All three groups speak different languages, have different levels of detail in terms of how they think about compliance. And being able to frame the value for each of them is really important when it comes to building the business and setting the stage, or as it were, for building commitment. The three steps that then combine to help sort of complete the business case is understanding the funding context and aligning with it. You know, people are looking at investing in compliance and security for different reasons. Sometimes it may be because the auditor has said that if you don't fix this, we're going to have to make a public announcement about some findings that we have concerning your company. On the other hand, you may have a need to scale IT resources and have a very different funding context for how you're going to automate different compliance related processes that the IT team needs to perform regularly. That will shift how folks evaluate the business case, and it will impact who you need to engage and how to engage them around the business case. A lot of times when people are thinking about the business case, they stop at value and stakeholder alignment, and they don't take into account the concerns that people will begin to have around adoption. It's really important when building a business case to think about how you are helping to frame the question around adoption and implementation. We'll get into all of these steps a little bit more in detail as we go through today's presentation. The last step is to think about anticipating the next project. It's not enough to think about compliance and security in today's world as one and done kind of investments. They inevitably lead to or lay the foundation for the next project, either because it has to do with building maturity around security and compliance, or it has to do with anticipating other systems coming online that perhaps last year were not considered material, not considered in scope for audit, but next year are, and are going to be in scope and are going to be considered material for the audit group. And so anticipating the next project and framing your business case in terms of that next project becomes really important in cementing the commitment that you can get from all three groups: audit, business, and IT. And then there are two tips that happen throughout the process. One is to have a bias for metrics, and we'll talk about that later as well. How important metrics are at the beginning of the process and at the end of the process. And then ensuring that what is being built around the business case is being built from a team perspective. The finance folks are able to contribute, audit is able to contribute, IT is able to contribute, so that when the business case is finally complete, everyone has had sort of their fingerprints on it. Everyone has had a sense to buy in because they've actually provided content necessary for the business case. So let's look at the first one, using language that connects. You know, the purpose of any business is not to deploy software. Almost every business today does deploy software, but they do it for some reason. And framing the business case in terms of the purpose of the business is an important first step. So for example, if you're in a healthcare company, How will the investments in SAP compliance, security, and control help with patient care? How will it improve the ability for your company to meet the demands around patients' rights and the expectations they should have around data protection? Being able to see things from that perspective becomes far more powerful than creating a proposal that talks about how we are going to deploy workflows to support role design, for example. Unless what you're talking about is anchored to the business purpose, you'll have a very narrow group who are concerned with what you're proposing. Likewise with financial services. If that's the purpose of your business, then thinking through how can the things that you're doing around SAP application control, security, and compliance, how does that relate directly to financial services? And then thinking in terms of the languages of your business becomes really important. And then the senior team, there's a strategy that every company has, whether it's being more aggressive in their competitive position within their segment, perhaps growing their segment. It could be a stronger orientation on return on assets, or improving perhaps gross margin. There's a variety of core goals that a senior team has. How do the investments around SAP compliance, risk, and control support that vision of the senior team? A simple example might be geographic expansion or M&A activity. How can the work that's being done around this proposal support the vision of the senior team? And then dropping down one more level, each functional area, whether it's IT or management or audit, are going to have their own goals. How does this how does this proposal fit into the way in which those goals are described? I'm not talking here just how does it support those particular goals, but what is the language that you could use to shape the business case aligned with the goals of audit or IT and management? And then lastly, there's usually a series of high-level priorities. It could be around digital transformation or globalization or profitability that the company shares. And tying your proposal or your business case into those high-level priorities becomes very important for just setting the basic foundation for building interest in what you're proposing. Next is framing it for each individual stakeholder. While it always comes down to these four components of cost, control, performance, and culture, it comes down in sort of different flavors, if you will. So for the business, cost control may have to do with improved productivity. So they have fewer mitigations to review. They can spend their staff in a different way, or perhaps performance is seen in terms of the availability of the SAP environment and the performance of the environment. Likewise with audit, perhaps the culture between the business is very different than the culture within audit, which might be much more cost sensitive, much more assurance oriented. And how do you then frame the value in terms of the culture of controls? IT, a very strong learning curve, always concerned about maintenance and wanting to move into more strategic projects. How does cost and control and performance of the IT organization, as well as the SAP platform, how does that get influenced by your proposal? And of course, the executive team. So thinking about these two parts of building interest around value become first oriented on the language that the business uses and that each group within the business uses, and then thinking about how to frame the value of what you're talking about to the different business groups, to the different functional areas. This socialization, if you will, of value then gets you into a position to begin to build commitment. And the first step around building commitment is really in terms of understanding and aligning with the funding context for the solution. So who is going to fund it? Does it come out of a slush fund that the CFO has? Is it a line item that's part of the SAP application owner or the SAP administrative budget? Is it part of a larger project? Is it part of perhaps a major cybersecurity initiative? And this is just a line item. Understanding how and who is funding the potential project goes a long way to helping you get the right business case in front of them. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along here. Many years ago, Gartner created a simple taxonomy for understanding budgeting. You could put it into, at that time, it was three buckets. You could put it in the RTV bucket, which meant it was funding necessary just to keep the business afloat, or in other words, to run the business. You could have funding that was available for projects which would improve the way business was being done, or it would optimize the business. And that's the OTB budget camp. Or you could transform the business. You could think about a very novel way of approaching something that would overwrite, if you will, the way things used to be done and give your company a much stronger strategic advantage in the marketplace. And that was transform the business. Within audit and compliance and security, there's also a fourth category called controlling the business. When the external auditors say that if you don't get this fixed, we're going to have to mention it in your 10Q or 10K, that creates a funding opportunity, if you will, that is independent of running, optimizing, or transforming the business. And it shapes the way in which the business case is evaluated and the way potential options for solving it are sorted. Another question to ask about the funding context is whether or not the project is considered a mandate, if it's strategic to the business, if it's simply incremental to what has already been done. For example, perhaps you already have some basic SOD controls in place and you're looking at simply extending that to improve the sensitive access controls or the better control over personally identifiable information, or simply to add it into the request and approval process, the provisioning process. It could be a cost improvement. In other words, it's not expected to require incremental funding, but it is expected to improve the way in which things are done. And then the business case itself will be evaluated potentially differently. It could be a standalone project that you're proposing, in which case it will need unique value. It will need to kind of stand on its own as to whether or not it will be done or not done. Or it could be considered a component, a part of a broader initiative. And then it's less perhaps around value, because that's going to be handled by the larger strategic initiative, and it's much more around determining how well your proposal fits in to a broader initiative. So for example, S4HANA migration. Perhaps there's a large S4HANA migration effort underway, and part of that migration effort is to upgrade your role catalog. Excuse me. And so how well does your proposal fit in with this broader S4HANA migration initiative? Whether it's a standalone initiative or whether it's part of a larger initiative, inevitably it will be your proposal, your recommendation will be evaluated against peers, not just at the project versus project level, but also at the implementation option level. So for example, PathLock would be compared against alternative solutions in order to identify which would be the best solution for your company. Understanding that business context will help you understand how to weight the different factors that go into scoring the options. It may be, for example, going back to the S/4HANA migration story or scenario, that the decision is between Pathlock and one of its competitors, and really understanding the automated role design capability and understanding the depth of the SOD matrix and how it gets integrated into the role design process really should be weighted much higher than other aspects that Pathlock could do. And likewise with its competitors, it should be that those weightings will be different based on whether the solution is going to be a component or whether it's going to be a standalone initiative. What are the roadmap expectations? It's very, very rare nowadays that we see one-off projects in the compliance and security space. Many years ago when SOX was just rolling out, there were a lot of one-off projects, but it's not so much the case now. In the middle season, between 5 and 10 years ago, there were some sporadic big bang projects that happened. We still see that in the SAP space around the move from access control oriented investments to process control oriented investments or initiatives. But more and more we're seeing a continuous approach to compliance and security roadmaps. And folks are looking at how can we make small incremental changes over time so that we're staying in sync with regulatory changes, we're staying in sync with how the business is changing and the risks, how they're emerging on the horizon. But what are those roadmap expectations? Because you'll end up framing your business case differently depending on how you answer this. And this can go a long way to aligning management around what to expect today and what to expect 9 months from now, which can help them make better decisions and feel more comfortable with the decisions they're making concerning your business case. And then inevitably connect the expected results to the purpose of the business. And there will be direct and indirect impacts. Let me just talk a little bit about that. So you may say that at the end of the project, you'll have a simplified control system or frictionless access, or you'll have repeatable tasks that are automated or administrative leverage. And whatever the end state is that you're looking at, it will have some direct impact. So for example, if we pick the bottom two, repeatable tasks or automated and administrative leverage allows you to use the same IT staff to cover much more of the organization or cover more of the organizational risks. That may lead to the direct impact of less IT staff spent on maintenance and audit, and perhaps less expensive and faster user management processes. Those direct impacts are going to ultimately lead to some indirect or second order impact. Perhaps because the IT staff now is spending less time on maintenance and audit requests, they're able to accelerate the digital transformation. And you get better margins and greater profitability for the organization as a whole. Being able to help management walk through in your business case how you're moving from defined end states or conditions that your project will create, the impact of those conditions, and then the indirect or second order impact that will happen because of the direct impact, can also help management understand the value of the business case that you've created. Moving from looking at funding context, the next step in the process is to progressively shift the business case from value, one of generating interest, to adoption and really understanding the implementation challenges and the adoption risks. When you think about adoption, I was talking to a CIO a few years ago, and as he was trying to evaluate a SOX compliance program, his first question was less around how does it help me with SOX, and more around how can I be sure that this process that you're suggesting will be adopted and that it will make sense and that people won't work around it. So as you consider implementation risks, consider how you're going to make things easier for the end user. End users are a lot like water. They follow the path of least resistance. And if the path of least resistance is the one that gives them the access they need faster, the ones that require the least amount of escalations, if that path of least resistance is tied in to the path that is most secure, then you get adoption. If, on the other hand, the path of least resistance means they continue to call their friend in IT to go around whatever process it is, and they just provision them access, and off they go, and it was little more than an email and a phone call, then that will continue to be the process. So really understanding how your proposal is going to make the path that is most secure also the path that water would flow through, because it's the path of least resistance. That will really begin to help build commitment from each of the different groups of stakeholders. And then, don't expect a tool to solve an existing process problem. There's an interesting book by a fellow named Jim Collins that talks about how companies can move from being good to great. His book, Good to Great, really focuses on only a handful of things that make a big difference. One of those 5 or so things that make a huge difference is the way in which IT solutions are procured. And his comments, as he studied some of the best performing companies on the planet, is that they start with understanding their processes. They understand what they want those processes to do, and then they have a question around the technology associated with making those processes real. They don't try to co-evolve the configuration of the project, both in terms of the technology and the process simultaneously. They definitely take a stepwise approach. And we'll talk a little bit about how being biased towards metrics really fits nicely with this. The next piece is to think about data. A lot of times when we're thinking about compliance processes, we think about data security, we think about automating compliance processes. We don't sometimes step back and think, not only should we make the data more secure, but how can we make the data more valuable? How can we use existing data or even create new data that will help the business? So for example, you may have a proposal that talks about how to improve your SOD mitigations, how to help that user access risk be better mitigated by the business. If you can talk about how there will be data associated with the actual financial exposure associated with each breach or each violation in your SOD rule set, and how that data can be used by the business to prioritize their risks. So for example, if I violate some SOD rule and it was $1 for a purchase order that I created in an invoice that I then approved on it, maybe that's not worth anybody's time. And just being able to know that I did it and triggering a mitigation requirement is not very productive. On the other hand, being able to prioritize my violation when I go and do it again, but this time for $1.5 million, now that's very much worth everybody's time. And so using data, in this case, the data associated with the documents that I changed in order to, as part of the violation of this SOD rule, using that data to help the business prioritize my SOD violation against other risks in the environment can become very useful. And so how does the proposal help create new data or allow existing data to become more timely, more contextualized, more normalized, even more useful? Having that as part of the business case around controls can become very helpful. There's a lot of research being done at universities in the United States that look at how to move towards a continuous audit process and how important it is that the data that is generated in the continuous audit activities is useful both to the audit team and to management and to those who are operating the business. And so looking at what data you can use as part of the solution will really drive adoption and help cement the value of what you're proposing in your business case. The last step is to anticipate the next project. Now, what does the 9-month project look like in IT? What's the IT backlog look like? Obviously, if there's an S4 migration going on, then how does this compliance project support that migration? What are audits' next likely concerns? Auditors are always looking for how to help add value, as everyone in an organization is. And so understanding audit's concerns, it may be that you're working or your proposal today is looking at audit's number one concern. Well, is the second concern or the number two concern that audit has, is that still considered an unacceptable risk? And then how could your project be a little extended or anticipate being modified later after its initial deployment to meet that second most burning concern that audit has? And how does this project support upcoming relationship or upcoming investments that are not IT related? So how can you anticipate the fact that the company is expanding into new territories, new geographies, or that it may be moving into new industries, and those industries have different regulatory requirements? Being able to frame your business case and helping folks understand how the implementation of that business case will support those other investments becomes really important as well. We often talk about software and projects and getting the business case justified in terms of licenses and in terms of capital, or at least significant operating expenses being spent on the project. But more and more with compliance and security, it's coming down to the content and not so much the product or the tool itself. So how is the content going to evolve over time as well? What small improvements to policies or to process definitions or to data can be done to support your different stakeholders that might not need incremental licenses or might not need additional operating expenses or more capital? A good example here is a friend of mine who runs the SAP landscape for a large services organization in the UK, looked at how he could take his control platform and begin to build out simple process controls that didn't require any more licenses. It just required a little bit more conversation between IT, audit, and finance, so that they could identify a couple of processes that might be improved if there were some controls applied to them. And they did that after a few months, and then it becomes another conversation with someone else in the business about how could the tool or the platforms that have already been deployed be used to support whatever processes or smaller compliance requirements they have, without necessarily requiring more licenses, but simply by changing the rules or adding rules or adding another workflow on an established process engine. This ability to anticipate the next project does not simply mean anticipating the next budget cycle. It can simply be focused on the needs of the business itself. So what are the tips? I talked about two tips. One being having a bias for metrics, and just a short story. When I can remember when I was first taught the formula for calculating work, and it's a very interesting formula. So if I have a small rock and I flick it and it moves a bit of a distance, that work was done. There was a bit of a distance that was covered, and there was some force applied to the rock to move it that distance. On the other hand, if I have a huge rock and I labor all day long pushing against that rock, and I struggle and I spend all the energy I have, and I don't move the rock at all, then at the end of the day, even though I am exhausted, even though I was focused, no work was done. And sometimes in business, that's what happens if we don't have metrics. We may go in and do something that dramatically improves the business, but it will be very difficult for many in the management of that business, it'd be very difficult for them to appreciate the work that was done if they don't have any metrics that they can use to gauge the improvements. And so having a bias for metrics, especially with compliance and security projects, that can help management actually see what changed and by how much, can go a very long way to helping senior managers who may be very unfamiliar with the different regulatory nuances and the different configuration requirements or the different policies that have to be carefully crafted. They may be very unfamiliar with all the work that went into it unless they have some degree of measurement, some set of metrics that help them quickly calibrate the amount of change. There's some of those metrics can be hard metrics around cost savings, like terminating support contracts with hardware, middleware, software, because a new platform is rolled out or a new compliance capability is rolled out. It may reduce MSP chargebacks if they're charging, if your managed service provider is charging you based on ticket count. It may or may not impact your user licenses. Sometimes a lot of companies have already a large inventory of licenses that they haven't deployed yet. But if they're near that border or near the edge of their inventory, it can a hard ROI can certainly be applied to that. A soft return on investment or soft metrics begin with really decomposing and measuring your processes. For those of you with an ITIL background, are very familiar with decomposing the incident management process, and it's very applicable to decomposing any process within IT and compliance. For example, walking through all of the different moments in which a request and approval process costs an organization, from understanding how long the end user has to find the right role to request or the right access to request, for the submission of the request for additional access, for the different research steps and review steps that have to happen, for the circling back. Perhaps there was a mistake when the role was requested and a different role is more appropriate for that user, going through the escalation process, finally provisioning the role and letting the end user know. Decomposing that process and identifying where waste or where inefficiencies are really the first step in understanding the ROI of a compliance investment. And then there's a whole body of knowledge around lean processes that allows you to get clear on or to search for where waste might be happening. So if you think about the lean manufacturing process, which really put Toyota and other manufacturers on the global competitive stage, and there's been a lot of work with IBM and others how those processes how those concepts can be applied to IT. And there's even an acronym called Tim Woods, I'm sure many of you already know, about how to analyze a process. Does it have two? So it's an acronym that stands for transport waste, inventory waste, motion waste, waiting time, overproduction, overprovisioning, defects, and skill gap or skill underutilization. And you can apply that. So if you look at, say, the process steps associated with doing user access recertifications, are there too many steps? And that's kind of mapping to the transport question. Do you have too many of these user access reviews being done because you can't differentiate the levels of risk associated with different aspects of your users? Is the motion associated with doing these reviews, does it have waste in it because the manager, as he gets the request to review certain access, now has to shift and pull up another report to do some analysis to see who he should certify or not? Is there a waiting period that's causing IT to sit around and have to wait and send requests or reminders that causes them to waste time? Each of these items can be applied to any process concern. Are those people who are doing it, just jumping to the skills side of it, are those persons who are doing the campaign, uh, do they have a certain set of skills that would be much more profitably deployed somewhere else in the organization than managing a user recertification campaign? Once you've broken that process down and looked at the different places of waste, you then can multiply those wastes by the number of times that process occurs. And it can be pretty surprising as to how much it might be costing the organization. There are various point metrics, but there are also coverage metrics, like how many access requests are now automated. And working with NBC Universal, one of the things that they did very well is to capture the metrics prior to implementing the solution and after implementing the solution. And because they were able to show a before and after, particularly around access requests and how much of them had moved on to an automated platform, and how it compressed the amount of time that people waited to get access, allowed them actually to have a conversation with very, very senior people in the organization about how their request and approval process had improved because of their investments in compliance tools. There's a variety of other things that you could look at. But one of the things that I want to really stress is that as you do this measuring, if you have this bias for metrics from the very beginning, you're beginning to define the current state. A lot of times, until you've been able to get at metrics, it's very difficult to validate that you could define the current process. You can use metrics as a way of assuring people that you do understand how the current process is executed and what the benefits would be with your business case. And then since you've measured it before, for example, maybe one of the measurements you take is how long does it take to get a patch applied to your SAP landscape? And because you've measured it once you've done your improvement, it's much easier for you to go back and measure that process again to capture the improvement than it would be if you hadn't measured it to begin with, to go back and try to re-engineer what the benefits might have been. So measuring early, defining that process, and then measuring afterwards really allows you to prove the success of your project. The second tip, well, I'm sorry, before I move on to the second tip, just a couple of comments around how others in the world are doing some things around measuring the benefits of improving compliance processes. This is from a Forrester study that just showed some of the huge benefits that come from being able to deploy SOD management solutions. And this particularly applies to being able to quantify your SOD violations so that you can automate some of the mitigation work and prioritize mitigation work more efficiently. This is one of the ways in which Pathlock engages its customers and prospects, is to sit down and look at all of the different processes that a particular company may have in place already, and then going through and totaling up what those costs are without Pathlock or business as usual, and then with Pathlock. And this value engineering, as it's sometimes called, process can really provide some very strong evidence for why your business case should move forward and gain the approval it needs. The second tip that I wanted to touch on was making it a team sport. Too often, when I looked at proposals, I've seen that folks haven't engaged the finance folks. So even though they have a really strong set of metrics, no one's believing those metrics because finance didn't put their numbers on it. Finance didn't feel like they were part of the interviews. They didn't, for example, a weighted average cost of capital, the WACC value may not have been the most recent one. Maybe it was something pulled from a previous template. And so because of that, it begins to get questioned. All of your metrics become questionable because finance doesn't feel like they were involved. So help them go to bat for you. Maybe you can draft the model, and then finance can come in and put in the numbers. Audits the same way. Perhaps you can draft an inventory of controls based on conversations with them, but finding someone in audit to help them engage and specifically build out that list and own the list of controls and how those controls, if automated, would improve audit's work. Helping them to own that piece can go a long way. And the same thing with involving managers. And one of my favorites is to find power users that are well respected in the organization, have them participate in your discussion early, and then quote them. Get a couple of quotes from them and include that in the business case, so that as you talk with others in the organization, you're able to show that you've got a firm grip on how it's going to affect everyone who's using the application. I will mention one thing. I was senior vice president at Visa was talking about, this is many years ago, but he was sharing with us how to build credibility whenever you're putting a business case together. And he said, no one makes a decision based on what is to the right of the decimal point. No one does that. However, how you got to what is to the right of the decimal point and having something that shows a value which has something to the right of the decimal is what establishes credibility in the proposal you're presenting. So while no one makes a decision based on what's to the right of the decimal point, a lot of people evaluate the quality of the proposal based on what is to the right of that decimal. I thought that was a very telling perspective. So let me just close as we come up on the end here with a quick recap. So frame the project first and foremost in terms of why your company exists. Don't talk about how you're deploying software or a new cloud solution, or you're hardening the RFCs, or you're improving patch management, because at the end of the day, that's not why the business exists. You've got to be able to put it in terms of how your investment or how your proposal is going to help perhaps create less risk in the supply chain if you're a manufacturer, improve patient health if you're healthcare, and so forth. Include all stakeholders early and make sure that you're using their language and help them to own it and hear what others are saying. Different projects have different motivations. Some may be a mandate, some may be strategic, some may be part of a broader initiative, and understand that and use those differences to make your business case something that is timely and pertinent to those who are also overseeing those other projects. And worth mentioning here is that a lot of times when it comes to building a business case, managers want to know that if this business case moves forward, they won't be inappropriately distracted. They want to be focused on the things they feel are most important to focus on. And if you come up with a project or a proposal that they will have to focus on, which takes away from where they feel their bigger priorities are, that's a very quick way of being able to shut down your proposal. But if you're able to show how it lines up with their motivation, it lines up with the priorities that they have, that becomes a very powerful way to begin to move your proposal to the next stage. Socialize value, but be prepared for questions about adoptions. Metrics, as I mentioned, will drive confidence. And you can expect more projects. So anticipate how your project will support what's coming and how your project will evolve. So it looks like I have come to the end of the road. I really appreciate everyone spending time with me today. I want to open it up for any questions. I hope folks found this useful. My intent was not to give you a template for every business case, but to help talk about 4 or 5 of the key drivers that will help you create the business case that works for your organization and frankly for your career. I don't see any questions in the question bar. So with that, I will give everybody 7 minutes and tell them thanks and wish everyone the happiest of holiday seasons. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steve. Just to wrap up a little bit, we have a promotion going right now. If you book a meeting with us and email events@pathlock.com before January 31st and mention you attended a session at the Innovation Summit, you will win a $25 Starbucks virtual card. So we encourage you to email events@pathlock.com. Again, I put in the chat a link to pathlock.com, the sessions that are coming up tomorrow. So if you would like to attend any of the sessions tomorrow, you can click on that and then you can register for those. It looks like we had, just a big thank you to Steve for his presentation from one of our attendees. So thank you for that. And with that, we just wanted to say thank you so much, Steve, for his presentation and for all of you for attending. And we hope to see you at our next events in the Pathlock Innovation Series.